Cole Harris was a man who had to go against his fate. Born and raised in one of the city's most crime-ridden neighborhoods, he knew from childhood how the world works, where labels are placed on you before you can even open your mouth. He was black, and that automatically gave those around him a reason not to believe in his success. But Cole wanted more than that. Every morning, Cole woke up in the tiny apartment on the west side of town, where his younger sister Mia and his mother Sarah lived with him. He would start his day early, making breakfast for the family, since his mother worked two jobs and came home late, and then go to his own job. Cole was a car mechanic in a small shop and loved what he did. Despite his fatigue, he came home each night feeling like he was doing his part to make a better life for his family. Working with cars gave him a chance to remove himself from the world, to be just a person, not an object of suspicion. Cole was 28 years old. He dreamed of opening his own machine shop, where he would not only repair cars but also train young boys from the neighborhood to do honest work. He knew how easy it was to take a wrong turn in places like this and was determined to give them the chance at a future he himself lacked. His dream was too big for one man, but Cole was the kind of man who would rather die fighting for his principles than bow to hardship. His sister Mia was in college. Cole had been a brother, father, and best friend to her, especially after their father had left the family when they were children. He'd supported her studies, even though it had cost him a lot of effort, financially and mentally. Sometimes he felt as if the world was pressing down on him from all sides, but he never showed fatigue, because he knew that for her sake he would endure. It seemed that despite the gray walls of the neighborhood and the stern looks on the streets, Cole managed to maintain his world where he was a good brother, a caring son, and an honest man. He tried to stay out of trouble, stayed out of conflict, and everyone around him seemed to accept it, even if they didn't respect him, at least. But there was a lurking uneasiness in him that had only grown stronger over the years. He knew that in the eyes of some, even the slightest mistake he made could be a disaster. He'd seen the law applied selectively many times along the way, and how people of his color were the first suspects, barely charged with anything. Then one day he ran into him, Officer Black, the man who would become his nightmare. Black was an arrogant police officer with a penchant for bias. Young, white, and confident, Black had been on the force for several years and had built a reputation as someone who gave no mercy to the wrong people. He knew exactly how to manipulate the system to get what he wanted. Individuals like Cole were easy targets for him, dangerous elements that needed to be kept under control. One evening as Cole was driving home from the workshop, he noticed Black pulling his car to a stop at the edge of the road. The officer approached him with a cold smile that boded trouble. From that moment on, Cole's life began to crack at the seams. Officer Kevin Black was a man everyone in town knew, if only in the shadow of his own fear. He used his position and service as a tool to create a myth around him of an all-seeing, relentless enforcer of the law. He had been a police officer for over a decade, and in that time had worked his way up the ranks from patrolman to senior officer in the narcotics division. But with each step, his power grew like a shadow over his own conscience, and Kevin became someone even his colleagues feared. From the beginning of his career, Black stood out for his dislike of dangerous neighborhoods and the people who lived in them. He was someone who didn't just police the city. It was as if he was waging his own personal war on crime as he envisioned it. In his eyes, criminals were those who were simply born in the wrong place with the wrong skin color. He partnered with others like him who were sure of their righteousness and obeyed his orders without question. Together, they patrolled the city with smiles that hid contempt and superiority. Kevin grew up in a family where the concepts of order and racial purity were almost sacred. His father, a former military man and an old-school supporter, taught his son that everyone should know his place and that some people, in their opinion, were to blame for their own poverty and shortcomings. From childhood, these views were firmly rooted in Kevin's mind, and even as a young boy, he always felt his superiority over those who lived on the other side of town. His father had always said, "Don't let them take away your right to be superior," and Kevin had followed that principle all his life. At work, he was surrounded by people who respected him but feared him. He was considered an experienced but aggressive officer, and many of his colleagues secretly guessed his views, but no one wanted to break the unspoken agreement. At the police station, Black commanded cold respect. His methods were harsh and sometimes illegal, but they produced results. The decline in street crime was to his credit, and management turned a blind eye to rumors about his methods. The closest to Black was his partner, Petty Officer Joe Brooks. Brooks wasn't as experienced or assertive, but he imitated Black in everything he did, as if absorbing his views. He admired Kevin's ability to keep things under control and was willing to follow his instructions without a second thought. To Brooks, Black was the model of a true officer, ruthless, confident, and always ready for extreme measures. One day when the Brooks was just starting out, Black rudely told him, "Either you're going to be part of the team or your place is here for a while." From then on, Brooks was loyal to his partner and asked no questions. But outside of their fighting fraternity, many knew that Black relished the opportunity to use his powers to humiliate and intimidate. It was sweet to him when people looked at his uniform in horror and averted their eyes. He especially enjoyed looking for an excuse to stop Black, those who, in his words, were always hiding something. He would often laugh disparagingly, 90% of the time I'm not wrong. If you catch one of them with something illegal, there's always a reason to think they're all the same. Once at a meeting when discussing the city's current drug trafficking situation, Black said with a chuckle, "We're not wrong, it's just that there are more of them, and our methods are too soft." No one responded, though many noticed the fire in his gaze, the fire that said that the lives and rights of others did not matter to him. When he first saw Cole Harris, an ordinary Black auto mechanic, Black felt the usual irritation and suspicion. To him, this guy looked like another guy who was just waiting for the moment to stumble. He saw Cole as the embodiment of all those he considered a problem for the town. He realized that Cole was just the right person to use as an example, and he would not miss the opportunity to do so. Black was used to searching cars under false pretenses when he saw Black people in them. Cole hadn't done anything suspicious, hadn't said anything provocative, but the mere fact that he was in a crime neighborhood was a reason for Black to be there. He'd been watching him for a long time, gathering evidence and waiting for the moment to seize the opportunity to frame him just as he'd done before. Only this time he decided to act with particular ferocity. Inside the precinct, Black had worked the plan to perfection, deciding that Cole would be the victim. It had to be a show of force to keep the others in check. It had been an ordinary evening for Cole Harris. A long day in the workshop, noisy and red-hot with work, ended with another difficult customer complaining of a loud noise in the engine. Cole fixed the problem, negotiated the details of the order, wiped his hands clean of oil, and glancing at his watch realized it was getting dark. His mother and sister were waiting for him at home, and he decided he had time to stop at a small supermarket in the center of the neighborhood for groceries. Cole got into his old Honda, a car he kept running by himself, and drove home. It was late, the streets were empty, and the streetlights dimly lit his way, casting shimmers in the windows and shadows on the pavement. Cole turned on some music, hoping to relax a little after a hard day, but fate was preparing him for an encounter that would divide his life into before and after. The patrol car, driven by Kevin Black, followed the road at a leisurely pace. Kevin always chose nighttime for his raids. The darkness gave him a sense of impunity and power, which he used without thinking. Black smirked inwardly as he spotted a familiar neighborhood ahead. The street was empty, and then his attention was drawn to a small black car driving down the same road. Kevin instantly noticed the black man behind the wheel, and his fingers instinctively gripped the steering wheel. Wrong place, wrong time, he thought with a grin, and beckoned to his partner. Joe Brooks, who was sitting next to him, realized at once that Black had found his prey again. He had seen that cold cruelty in his partner's eyes more than once, but he dared not say anything. The fear of losing his place and going against his partner was stronger. Turning on his blinkers, Black accelerated the car sharply and approached Cole. When he noticed the patrol lights, Cole was surprised at first, but then carefully parked at the curb, wondering what he could have violated. He turned off the engine, glanced regretfully at the bag of groceries on the passenger seat. He just wanted to drive home and spend the evening with his family. Black got out of the car and walked over to Cole's window. His gaze was icy, devoid of any hint of friendliness. Cole opened the window and asked calmly, "Officer, is something wrong?" Black leaned toward him, and Cole thought he saw a sneer in his eyes. "That's up to you, kid. See, I saw you cross a double line." "A double solid? But I was going straight and—" Cole started, but Black interrupted him with a raised hand. "Hush," he said, looking at him with contempt. "Maybe I should check your car. I wouldn't be surprised if you had something illegal in there." Cole felt anger boiling up inside, but he held back. He knew it was better not to argue, not to be confrontational. He'd heard stories about how one could be accidentally guilty, but he'd never imagined it would happen to him. "Check it out," he said calmly, hoping it wouldn't take too long. Black ordered him to get out of the car and stand by the hood. Cole complied, sensing the growing tension. Brooks, meanwhile, went around the car and started looking inside, putting his hands under the seats, in the trunk, checking every little thing. Cole hated to see other people's hands going through his things, but he kept quiet, restraining himself. "You seem to like order," Black said mockingly, peering into the trunk. He turned to Cole, who was already looking at him with confusion in his eyes. "What if I told him I just found something really interesting in your place?" "What are you talking about?" Cole replied, puzzled. In response, Black pulled out a small bag of white powder and showed it to Cole. There was that cruel sneer in his eyes that made Cole go cold. He realized in that instant that he wasn't going to get out of this unpunished. "It's not mine." Cole felt his voice shake. "I don't keep anything like that on me. You can't just drop it off." But Black, without letting him finish speaking, grabbed his arm and pinned it behind his back, handcuffing him. "You'd better bite your tongue," he said with an icy grin. "People like you always say the same thing. You're all innocent, aren't you? But I know you're all scumbags, ready to do your worst at any opportunity. You think you're smart? Let's play your game." Cole was stunned and frightened. He tried to explain, but every word he said was drowned out by Black's cynical smirk and Brooks's indifferent stare. At that moment, Cole realized he was trapped in a trap from which there was no escape. Cole stood by the patrol car, ducking under the force with which Black had pinned his arms and cuffed him. His ears were buzzing, a rising panic that pressed from within. He was a uniformed man, a lawman, but now he was looking at him like a predator that had found prey. Cole tried to protest, but Black rudely interrupted him. "Shut up, boy. You think you can slip out? This isn't the kind of street where you can talk without consequences," he said, pulling Cole's hands behind his back so hard he could barely keep from screaming in pain. "You know, there's always a place for people like you behind bars." Brooks continued his search, going through Cole's belongings. Brooks, aggressive and unwilling to show weakness in front of his partner, tried to pretend that he was looking for something suspicious. He'd seen Black do his job more than once and knew it wasn't his place to question his actions. But he also couldn't help but notice that everything that was going on was a farce. Even if nothing was found, he was sure Black would find a way to find the evidence. Black lifted the bag of white powder to eye level, as if it were prey, and then tossed it onto the hood so that Cole couldn't help but see it. Seeing the baggie, Cole knew exactly what was going on in an instant. His heart sped up, adrenaline rushing into his bloodstream, and the terror grew with each passing second. "You can't," Cole began, panting with indignation and fear. "It's not mine. You planted it. I don't keep anything like that. It's not true." But his words seemed to vanish into thin air, never reaching the ears of the police. Black turned to him with a smirk. "You know how many guys like you I've caught before. And every time it's the same thing. Not mine. It was a plant. You really think anyone's going to believe you? You're just another small-time drug dealer caught in my zone." Cole choked with despair, feeling the world around him crumbling. But there was nowhere to retreat. He tried once more to appeal to Brooks. "Officer, please, this is a mistake. It's not true. I have a job. I have a family. I have a family waiting for me at home. I can't lose everything because of a lie." He tried to look at Brooks, hopefully, as if he were the last straw, but all he saw was his cold, blank stare. Brooks turned away, avoiding Cole's gaze as if it were an order not to see, hear, or question. He knew that even if he wanted to, he couldn't change anything. It was a choice. protect his partner, or go against him and ruin his reputation forever. Look, buddy, you better shut up and keep your mouth shut, Black said coldly. Or do you think it's hard for me to convince the court that you were also aggressive when you were arrested? Cole realized that everything he said would be used against him. Every protest he made, every cry of desperation, only made Black more certain that he was guilty. It was a vicious circle where Cole, even though he was innocent, couldn't prove his case. What, you ready to ride with me to the station? Black asked mockingly, tugging on Cole's shoulder. Cole, who was becoming increasingly panicked, began to choke. The world he'd worked so hard to build, his dreams of a workshop and a quiet life, were shattering in an instant. He realized that this was no longer a game. This was his reality. You have the right to remain silent, Black said mockingly. You know, it wouldn't do you any good, though. Black led Cole to the car, intending to take him to the station, knowing that now he would become nothing more than a statistic, another defendant sucked into the vortex of the judicial machine. Cole Harris sat on the hard metal bench in the police station, feeling the cold of the stone through his clothes. A drop of sweat rolled down his face, leaving a trail of ice as he stared at the bars in front of him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He still couldn't believe he was here, that the world around him had collapsed in an instant. A joke, a gross mistake, the brutality of a man in uniform. After his arrest, Cole was immediately placed in solitary confinement, where he waited hour after hour, watching the lights fade and the silence slowly absorb the sounds of the night. The cell was small, with concrete walls that seemed to enclose him, denying him the right to live. The window high above his head let in only a faint ray of light from the street lamp, casting shadows like prison bars. Cole sat with his arms around his head, still stunned by what had happened. His thoughts swirled in an endless maze of horror. How had this happened? How could he be in a place he thought he had no right to be? Images of his family, the faces of his mother and sister, swirled in his mind. He tried to calm down, to understand what to do next, but hopelessness was growing in his soul. An inner voice whispered, "Who needs you, Cole? Who will believe in your innocence?" Suddenly, the cell door creaked open and footsteps were heard in the hallway. Two officers, Black and Brooks, stopped in front of his cell. They approached the bars, their silhouettes looking menacing in the dim light. "So, honest worker, how's it sitting?" Black said mockingly, crossing his arms over his chest. His eyes glowed with a triumph that sent shivers down Cole's spine. "Aren't you ashamed? You know it's a setup." Cole's voice shook, barely holding back tears. "I didn't do anything. You just ruined my life." "Oh, we're not embarrassed at all," Brooks snorted, grinning. "In fact, it's kind of fun. You're just another delinquent, kid. And you know what the funny thing is? Nobody's even going to check to see if you're guilty or not. You're just another number on the report." Black slowly stepped closer and leaned against the bars so Cole could see his face and every nuance of his expression. His voice became even quieter, more ingratiating. "Cole, remember this moment. This place is for people like you. You think someone's going to come looking for proof of your innocence? You're naive. All you have to do is accept your fate. You've always been a problem for this town, even if you don't realize it." With those words, Black slammed his palm on the bars and walked out, leaving Cole alone with his despair. It was hard to breathe, a lump in his throat. He felt like he was in a trap with no way out. The silence of the cell only added to his anxiety, and Cole realized more and more that no one was coming to rescue him. He was alone in this ruthless system where his life meant nothing. Cole spent the rest of the night sleepless, staring at the ceiling and going over in his head the memories in which his life had been normal. Working in the workshop, taking care of his family, dreaming of the future. But that world no longer existed. It was now reduced to a cell that smelled damp and hopeless, and a looming indictment that could ruin his life forever. Early in the morning, the cell door opened again, and the guard, without a word, led Cole into a small interrogation room. Waiting for him at the desk was the public defender, a middle-aged woman in a strict gray suit who barely glanced at him as she typed something on a laptop keyboard. She had a professional and detached expression on her face, as if she saw not a person but a series of documents to be processed. "Cole Harris?" she asked dryly, not even lifting her head. Yes, it's me, Cole replied, trying to contain the excitement that was about to erupt into a scream. My name is Sarah Wells. I'm your public defender, the woman said, skimming through some paperwork. According to the charges, you were arrested with a large quantity of illegal substances. You were found in possession of heroin, which is classified as a serious offense. If convicted, you face 5 to 10 years in prison. Cole swallowed, feeling the ground go from under his feet. He tried to pull himself together to explain his version of events, but his voice still shook. This is a mistake, Ms. Wells. I didn't have any drugs on me. The officer who took me into custody set the whole thing up. He hates people like me, and he planted this on me. I got nothing to go to jail for. Sarah frowned slightly and finally looked up at him. She paused for a moment, as if assessing how much she could trust his words. Cole, she began, changing her tone to a soft but still detached one. I've been working with public defenders for years, and believe me, every suspect claims innocence. Without proof, it will just be your word against theirs. I understand, but it's the truth, Cole whispered desperately. I didn't have anything with me. They just made it up. Please help me. I know it's hard to prove, but I'm innocent, and I can't just give up. Sarah bit her lip, clearly holding back her irritation. Look, I have to put together a preliminary defense, she said, raising her voice slightly. And to do that, I have to rely on facts that can be corroborated. Right now, we have nothing but your word. The officers have a bag of the substance in your arrest reports, which say you were caught with evidence. If you want to justify yourself, you need something concrete. Cole felt everything shatter inside. The lawyer's words were a cold shower. He'd thought the defense attorney would help him understand, but he realized that his version was viewed with the same skepticism as the prosecution's. Please, Ms. Wells, he said, looking at her with desperation, you must at least try. This officer, he's turned against me. He's taunting me, wanting to make me look guilty. Isn't there any way to prove it? Sarah sighed, rolling her eyes tiredly, as if she had another useless task on her shoulders. She pulled out a photo from Cole's arrest that showed a bag of drugs allegedly found in his car. Look at this, she said dryly, tossing the photo on the table in front of him. It's evidence, and your word alone isn't enough against it. If you had a single witness to corroborate your story or a surveillance tape, it would help a lot. But there are no street cameras in your neighborhood, and even if there were, we don't have the resources to look for them. Cole remained silent, stunned by her indifference. He understood that Sarah was overloaded with cases, that the system she belonged to saw him as just another case, not worth much attention. But it seemed to him that anyone in his position would have despaired. How could anyone prove the truth if no one wanted to hear it? Look, Cole, Sarah continued, her tone softening a little. I can't promise you that the court will side with you. On the contrary, the odds are very slim. My advice is to take the plea and make a deal. You plead guilty, you'll get less years. 5 years, maybe 3, with good behavior, and you'll get out. If you continue to insist on innocence, however, the chance of getting the maximum sentence is too great. When Cole learned from his lawyer that the system was unlikely to believe him, he realized that he could not fight alone. The only hope left was his family. They were the only ones who truly knew him, who knew he would never do what he was accused of. And if anyone could try to prove his innocence, it was only those who loved him. On the first day after his arrest, as rumors of what had happened began to spread, his sister Marie took on the role of detective. Marie couldn't just sit idly by while her brother, an honest, good-hearted man, found himself in solitary confinement on false charges. She realized right away that the police were unlikely to help or even listen to them. They would have to act on their own. That evening, Marie gathered some of Cole's closest friends, Jacob, Marcus, and Kate, his neighbors and best friends, and laid out the plan. They would search for proof of his innocence, even if it required days and nights of poring over camera footage, asking people to speak in his defense, looking for any trace, any lead that would help shed light on the truth. Look, Marie said eagerly, we all know Cole. This is a setup, but to prove it, we need to become his defense attorneys. Since the lawyer never did it for him, we don't have time to wait, we have to act. They started by going to the place where Cole had been apprehended. It was the alley he'd used to get home. Lonely, gray, and deserted, it seemed quite ordinary. But Marcus noticed something important. Next to the alley, there was a small store with a surveillance camera on its facade. Marie felt a surge of hope, and without wasting time, they went inside. "We really need the footage from your camera from last night," Marie said to the shopkeeper, an older man who looked anxiously at the excited group in front of him. "We know it could help save our friend from an unjust sentence." The man, seeing their desperation, reluctantly agreed to give them the tape, but warned them that the cameras did not see very well at night. Still armed with hope, they took a copy and went to Marcus's house, where they plugged the disc into the computer. The videotape was murky, dim, but they could see Cole walking calmly down the street, not looking at anyone, when a police car pulled up behind him. "Look," Jacob whispered, pointing to the moment when Officer Black stepped out of the car. "You can see here that he doesn't just hold him back. He starts grabbing him right away, pushing him. Cole doesn't do anything. He doesn't even resist. But even that tape wasn't enough to prove the frame-up, and Marie knew it. They needed more convincing evidence. They needed people willing to testify to Cole's honesty and tell of his integrity and innocence. Marie began going around to neighbors and family friends, gathering stories about the kind of man Cole was, how he never messed around with drugs and always worked honestly. But as she talked to people, it became clear to her that many were afraid to come forward. Fear of possible retribution from the police and distrust of the system held people back. There was one witness, however, an old lady named Mrs. Evelyn, who lived next door and had known Cole since he was a child. She liked to tell how he helped her carry her bags and fixed her old car without asking for anything in return. Marie, hearing this, asked Mrs. Evelyn if she was ready to speak up for Cole. But the old woman shook her head. "Honey, I'm 90 years old," she said. "Do you think anyone will listen to me? But I'm going to help you in another way." She told Marie that across the street, in a house across the street, lived a man named Henry, who often moonlighted as a fixer for the local security cameras and liked to check on their work at all hours of the day. Perhaps he might have a recording of that night. Marie knew Henry and knew that he was a secretive man who didn't like to get involved in other people's business, but she decided to try her luck. When she knocked on Henry's house, she was opened by a wary-looking man who listened to her request and immediately frowned. "You want me to go up against the key?" he asked, glaring at Marie. "Baby, you know how they work, don't you? You stick your head out and they'll blow it right off." "Please, Henry," Marie urged him. "I know you're afraid, but they set my brother up. He's innocent, and you know it. You have a chance to help prove the truth. Don't you see how important that is?" After much persuasion, Henry gave in and let Marie and friends look at the footage. It clearly showed the patrol car pulling up behind Cole, Black looking around to make sure no one was watching, tossing a small bag near his feet. "This is it. This is what we've been looking for," Marie exclaimed, barely holding back tears of relief. Now they had hard evidence that could change the course of the case. When the story of Cole's arrest began to gain momentum, one man couldn't stay away. Peter Ridley, a reporter for an independent newspaper, noticed something odd about the case. He was an experienced reporter, used to unraveling the most convoluted cases, and often picked up on what others considered insignificant. But this case, the story of a young Black man accused of drug possession, made him suspicious. Peter realized how often such charges were simply a stigma created by the system to leave a person without a chance. Something inside told him something was clearly wrong here. First and foremost, Peter began gathering information about Officer Black's reputation. A few short calls to colleagues, conversations with people living in the neighborhood, and he managed to find out that Black had a reputation as a tough, uncompromising police officer who had repeatedly used his position to keep people in fear. There were rumors among the locals that Black had abused his power on numerous occasions and had been particularly frequent in stopping Black residents of the area, checking their cars for no reason. This data was insufficient for an indictment, but Peter felt it was worth digging deeper. He decided to meet Cole's family. The next day, Peter arrived at Marie's house and knocked on the door. He saw the tension and wariness in Marie's eyes, as if she had been expecting the worst from everyone who came to her doorstep in the past few days. Good afternoon. My name is Peter Ridley. I'm a journalist. He introduced himself, showing his ID. I want to help your brother. I know he's facing something unfair, and I want to get to the bottom of it. Marie, after looking him over incredulously, let him inside. She talked about Cole, his life, his honesty and hard work, and how his arrest had been like a trap. Peter listened intently, noting every detail, and when Marie mentioned the security video that captured the moment of the frame-up, he felt a surge of hope. Can you give me a copy of the recording? I'll make sure it gets to the right people, he asked, leaning forward slightly to show his willingness to fight with them. Marie hesitated. She knew that turning the tape over to a journalist might draw more attention, but she also realized that it might put her and Cole at even greater risk. Her hope for the truth overcame her fear, however, and she agreed. Peter picked up the tape and headed for the newsroom. Over the next few days, he kept digging and found more and more information. He managed to find several of Black's former colleagues who, on condition of anonymity, told of his rude behavior, discrimination against Black citizens, and aggressive interrogations. One of them, a former police officer, told Peter, "This guy, Black, had always enjoyed power. For him, the color of a person's skin was always the first thing he saw. To be honest, I never wanted to work with him. It was clear that sooner or later it would lead to trouble." These words only confirmed what Peter already suspected. But as soon as his articles about it appeared in small independent publications, trouble began. One evening on his way home, he noticed that someone was following him. A man in dark glasses and a leather jacket followed him slowly, hiding his face. And when Peter stopped in front of his house, the stranger said without removing his glasses, "You shouldn't be digging into this case, journalist. Some things are better left as they are." With those words, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Peter confused. It was a warning, and Peter realized that someone had begun to notice his investigation and clearly didn't want the truth to surface, but Peter didn't stop. The next day, he went to Marie again to warn her that the situation had escalated and that they needed to be more careful. He promised he would not back down and soon published an article citing all the evidence he could find of Black's bias and cruelty. This article caught the attention of activists and community organizations who began demanding an investigation into the officer's actions. Peter knew that this was only the beginning and that now Black and his men would not leave him alone. Soon he received a call. It was Black himself, and his voice was cold but reserved. "Ridley, you don't realize you're playing with fire," he said threateningly. "Think of your family. Think of your job. I don't think you want to lose all that to some criminal. It's your choice." After that call, Peter was finally convinced that Cole's case was not just a miscarriage of justice, but a deliberate frame-up, with a darker and more dangerous force behind it. A determined fire flared up in him, and now he was ready to fight not only for Cole, but for anyone who had ever suffered from the injustice of the system. Peter knew now that he was willing to risk everything for the truth. After Black's call, Peter Ridley realized that he had probably crossed a line that would not let him back down. But instead of fear, it only spurred him on. He wasn't just facing a case. He was facing a web of manipulation woven into the fates of innocent people. There was too much at stake, and Peter knew that if he didn't break that chain, there would be more like Cole. One night, while sitting in the newsroom reviewing the latest Black case files, he came across a folder of drug arrests. As Peter delved into the data, his eye caught on one of the reports that listed a teenager named Tyler who had been arrested about 2 years ago. The name wasn't familiar to him, but something in the report looked suspiciously familiar. Black had been investigating the case, and the case was reminiscent of Cole's story. A teenager had allegedly been busted with a small amount of drugs in a similar scenario while patrolling a dark street. Peter found another case and then another. All of them had about the same charges: possession or distribution of drugs, being arrested alone, as if the police were deliberately catching people when there were no witnesses around. He realized it was a well-oiled scheme that Black was using. On another evening, Peter met with a lawyer he knew who also studied police cases. He confirmed the journalist's conjecture. The officer had a whole system that had been worked out to the last detail. Using his position, he could easily accuse a person who did not please him, or simply the Black residents of the neighborhood, and thus clean the streets, supposedly fighting crime. Peter could feel the indignation rising in him. He knew it would take more than testimonials and old reports to get published in a newspaper. The next day, Peter decided to contact Henry, the neighbor who had provided the camera footage of the setup. Peter hoped that Henry might have some more information that might shed some light on Black's actions that night. Meeting him in a private place, out of sight, he listened to Henry, who, after much deliberation, admitted that he had another file, a tape recording of Black talking to another policeman. When Peter listened to the tape, he shuddered. In the conversation, Black was mockingly explaining how arrests had to be done correctly to get rid of evidence that might cast doubt on the prosecution. The words were truly shocking. No witnesses, no bickering. We just show them who's in charge and it's over, Black said coldly, as if it were a routine task. This data was a real find for Peter. Direct evidence of corruption and criminal actions. Peter realized that with this, he had a chance to solve Black's case and show that he wasn't just applying pressure, but literally fabricating evidence against the innocent. Realizing that this evidence could cost him his career and possibly his life, Peter made a decision. He would go public, but he would do it in such a way that he would not be the only one to keep the records. If necessary, he hoped that the public would protect him, as well as his editor, whom he was willing to convince to take the risk for justice. Peter contacted the editorial office and placed all the documents in the hands of the editor-in-chief, warning them that they needed to prepare for a police response. The newspaper was preparing to publish an exposé that would be scandalous and attract national media attention. The editor's office kept the material virtually under lock and key until the day of publication, and Peter could feel the tension as he waited for everything to become public. Shortly after preparations for publication began, Black learned that his case was being solved. He sprang into action. Rumors surfaced that Peter was allegedly involved in dubious investigations. Calls aimed at disinformation began to arrive on the phone of the editorial office, and one of the agents close to Black tried to convince other police officers to join the campaign against the journalist. But Peter didn't give up. On the day of publication, he watched his editorial board send out an exposé article. The text caused a public uproar. Front-page headlines were devoted to exposing corruption, and Cole's picture next to the caption, "Innocent," became a symbol of the fight against police brutality. The public and human rights organizations made waves demanding an immediate investigation into Black and his methods. It was a total win for Peter. The sun was slowly rising over the city, illuminating the streets with a bright light. This morning was a new beginning for Cole, but he also knew that there were challenges ahead that could break even the most resilient of men. Today was the court hearing where he would finally get his chance to prove his innocence. Worry gripped him, but beyond the nervousness there was hope. As Cole was led into the courtroom, he felt the eyes of many people on him. Family, friends, and even strangers all came to support him at this important moment. His attorney, Laura, was a seasoned professional and a real fighter, but Cole's face reflected doubt. He felt a sense of injustice. How could he be in this situation when the whole system was against him? The courtroom filled with noise as the judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern face, entered the room. She looked around the room and silence reigned momentarily. The first order of business was the subpoena, and the prosecutor, Mr. Smith, began his speech, trying to present the case as a standard, uncluttered affair. "Honorable Court, we are presenting a drug possession case," he began, picking up the documents. "All evidence indicates that the defendant, Mr. Colin Duran, had the intent to distribute illegal substances." Laura, sitting next to Cole, listened to his clenched fists. She knew she needed to not only refute the accusations, but also make Black look unfavorable. She rose to ask her questions. "Mr. Smith, can you confirm that the arrest was made according to protocol?" she asked sharply. "Of course," the prosecutor replied, but there was doubt in his voice. "Based on what evidence?" "We saw that evidence was planted and the arrest process itself was suspicious. How can you say that your methods were legitimate?" These words caused a commotion in the hall, and those present began to whisper. Laura was confident in her words and continued. She presented a video of Black throwing drugs into Cole's car, showing everyone that it wasn't just an accident, but a planned setup. However, no matter how hard Laura tried, the resistance from the police was stiff. Black, already clenched in his chair and looking haggard, was not about to back down. He kept intercepting the prosecutor's glances and tried to maintain a semblance of confidence. Soon the witnesses began their testimony. "Can you tell us exactly what happened that night?" Laura asked the man who had witnessed the setup. "I saw Officer Black walk up to the car and start doing something," the witness said, while avoiding looking at Black. "I didn't know he was planting drugs. I just got scared and drove away." The witness's words raised a wave of discontent. Black and his colleagues looked increasingly tense. One of the officers, also present at the scene, was clearly trying to avoid a direct answer. Laura stepped forward again, ready to ask questions. "So you confirm that you did not see Cola doing anything illegal? You didn't see him trying to hide drugs or do anything else?" "No, the officer replied, clearly confused by his words. Laura cleverly seized the moment, using every ambiguity in the witnesses' answers to undermine their version of events. The situation was escalating and tensions were rising. The prosecutor realized that things were not going the way he had planned and began to resort to deceitful manipulations. He tried to divert attention by asking questions that could divert attention from the main topic, the frame-up. "How can you say this wasn't a routine arrest? The defendant has a criminal record, doesn't he?" With those words, he tried to make Cole look bad, but Laura was already prepared for that. "No, he didn't have a criminal record," she shouted, defending her client. "Mr. Duran is a hard-working man who has never broken the law. He was charged under false pretenses." Cola felt his strength leave him as the pressure increased. He knew he had the truth on his side, but the system didn't always favor those who opposed it. Finally, the judge entered the room, and soon it was time for closing words. Laura, full of determination, stood before the court and began with clear words. "Dear court, not only do we see indirect evidence, but genuine manipulation that has been done against my client. Mr. Duran has been the victim of bias and abuse of power. I urge you to look at the system that allows these actions to occur and make the right decision." Laura's words made a strong impression on everyone present. When the judge looked at Cole, he saw a spark of understanding in her eyes. It was up to her now. "I call a recess," the judge said, and the courtroom filled with tense silence. Cola, feeling short of breath, looked at his loved ones. This fight was just beginning, and he knew he wouldn't give up until he saw justice served. The day of the trial was full of tension and anticipation. After the judge called a recess, the court corridor was buzzing with conversation. Laura and Cola were sitting on the sidelines discussing possible scenarios of further developments. Cola felt time dragging on. His thoughts were full of apprehension, but he knew that Laura was doing her best to expose the system that had betrayed him. The meeting continued, and soon Officer Black was called into the courtroom. His appearance was a real sensation. He came with the evident intention of presenting his version of events, but the air around him was filled with danger, and his confidence was clearly shaken by the pressure of the evidence gathered. Black walked into the hall with a cold but angry expression on his face. Sitting on the witness bench, he stared at Coke as if his life depended on it. The judge, turning to Black, asked sternly, "Officer Black, do you realize that your testimony could have serious consequences?" "Yes, Your Honor," Black said, trying to maintain a semblance of calm. But his voice was shaking, and everyone realized that fear and confusion lurked behind the facade of confidence. Laura approached him, starting to ask questions that only served to increase his tension. Each of her questions pressured Black, forcing him deeper into his lies. "Are you saying that your arrest was lawful?" she asked, keeping her gaze on him. "Yes," Black answered almost in a whisper, but there was already a shadow of doubt in his eyes. "And you didn't see the drugs being planted?" This time he faltered, and there was a distinct hesitation in his answer. I can't, I can't remember," he said, rubbing the back of his head, as if trying to force the unbearable truth out. Laura, sensing that the cornered Black was ready to break, began to press him further. "Officer Black, we've seen footage of you planting drugs. Don't you think your silence will not only deceive us, but the entire system you serve?" Silence ensued. Black finally exploded. "I did it to be successful. I wanted to show that we fight crime, that we keep the streets safe." The courtroom fell silent. His voice was filled with fear and self-loathing. In that moment, he realized that it was his actions that had jeopardized not only Cole's life, but his own career as well. Laura didn't stop there. She walked towards her goal like a seasoned predator. Do you realize that by doing this, you are undermining the credibility of the entire police force? She asked with cold determination. Your actions have not only killed an innocent man, but have ruined the lives of many others. Black looked down, his face flushed with shame. This was his defeat, his downfall. I, I didn't know how to stop it, he said, losing the last vestiges of dignity. I was just doing what was asked of me. The courtroom exploded. The judge banged her gavel, demanding silence. But now the deed was done. Black had finally pleaded guilty. After these events, the system finally began to realize the seriousness of the problem. The prosecutor, who had initially maintained an everything is fine attitude, now looked confused and bewildered. Black had become a pawn, a victim of a system he had created himself. The trial continued, but it was now clear that the outcome would not only affect Cole's fate, but also the police itself. Teams were set up to begin reviewing Black's cases and introducing reforms to prevent a recurrence. These included police training programs to combat bias and abuse. It became clear to everyone that the system that allowed such actions to occur with impunity needed to be overhauled. Cola, holding back tears, realized that this was only the beginning. When the judge announced the verdict and Black was found guilty, Cola felt a lightness in his heart. Though he knew it wouldn't undo all the suffering he'd endured, he felt that justice had been served. The family and friends gathered in the courtroom stood up, applauding the court's decision. Cola, standing with Laura by his side, smiled. He knew that their fight was not over, but they had taken the first step to fixing the world in which he was now allowed to live freely. It was their victory, and they hoped that others who faced similar difficulties would also find the strength to fight for the truth. Soon the court reconvened, but this time the atmosphere was different. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens eager to witness a historic moment. Everyone knew that Officer Black's fate was being decided not only for him, but for the entire law enforcement system in which he served. Cola and Laura sat together full of anticipation, but with a sense of hope in their hearts that justice would finally be served. When Black was called in for questioning, he looked depressed. Tired eyes betrayed his inner state. He realized that his arrogance and indifference to the lives of others had ultimately brought him to this moment. The judge, with a slight bitterness in her voice, announced the beginning of the interrogation. Officer Black, are you aware that your actions have had serious consequences? The judge began, addressing him. Yes, Your Honor, he muttered, trying not to meet Cola's eyes. You have confessed to your criminal actions. How can you justify your behavior? Black hesitated. The look that had been full of contempt was now full of fear and remorse. I thought I was serving the cause that way, he squeezed out. I was trying to show that we were fighting crime, but his words hung in the air, and Laura didn't miss the opportunity to compliment. You were trying to serve a cause, but in reality you were destroying lives. Can you tell us exactly how you planted the drugs? Black, as if losing his last defense, revealed his actions, how he had deliberately planted drugs to boost his performance and please his superiors. This confession came as a shock to everyone in the room. The day after the interrogation, protests and rallies took place throughout the city. People demanded reforms in the police force and denounced the systemic racism that created such situations. By pleading guilty, Black became a symbol of corruption and law enforcement inaction. Rumors of his confession reached the higher echelons of power. The police leadership, realizing that they were under pressure, began to act. Commissions of inquiry into the actions of police officers were established, as well as training programs to eliminate bias and teach respect for human rights. As Cola watched these changes, he realized that their struggle with the system had not been in vain. He, along with other victims, finally began to see the results of their efforts. Despite the positive changes, it was far from the end of the story for Cole and his family. Every day was a reminder of the grief they had experienced, but they were not going to give up. Now they were going to use their story to help others in similar situations. Cola decided to become an activist and work for change in the justice system. His devastation turned into determination, and he began speaking at community events about what had happened to him. His voice was resounding, and he inspired others to fight for justice. In conclusion, the story of Coles and Officer Black was a reminder that confronting systemic injustices takes courage and determination. A system full of corruption and bias was able to admit its mistakes, but not without suffering. Cola now knew that his story was not only his personal struggle, but also part of a global struggle for human rights and justice. This story was a reminder that every action has consequences and that one cannot remain indifferent to the suffering of others. As Cola continued his mission to make a difference in the world, he realized that even the darkest of circumstances can lead to a brighter future. Hope was alive, and each new day brought an opportunity for change. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.